The movers thought it was a party. They padded up the caged stairwell, buzzed the intercom, and when the front door opened, they walked into a room the color of dried blood. They found a young woman dead on the living room floor, and upstairs, 4 more people beaten beyond recognition. This is 8763 Wonderland Avenue. This is what we call, simply, Wonderland. I'm Alexandra Monroe. Welcome to Still Unanswered. Tonight, we return to Laurel Canyon, to a white stucco townhouse with pit bulls behind a metal cage, and to a trail of drugs, thefts, and terror that ended in a brutal, almost ritualistic set of killings in the early morning hours of July 1st, 1981. With me is Dr. Marcus Ellery, criminologist and historian of Los Angeles crime. Marcus, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Alex. This is one of those cases that refuses to get tidy. The violence, the players, the intersection of Hollywood and organized crime, it's like a perfect storm for ambiguity.
Perfect storm, yeah. Before we get into who did what, I want to set the atmosphere. Laurel Canyon in the late 70s and 1980, remember it as a kind of rock and roll myth. But by then, it had frayed edges. Cocaine, heroin, a nightlife industry that left people vulnerable to predators. Edenic mythology peeling off, revealing something much darker. Marcus, how do you think the setting mattered?
Marcus, how do you think the setting mattered?
It mattered in every way. Laurel Canyon had always been a concentrated social network, musicians, producers, people who work nights. That density turned into a convenient market for traffickers. When you have a locale where people are awake at odd hours, where secrecy is valued and reputations are currency, the drug economy grows roots. The Wonderland house was not some out-of-the-way den. It was embedded in the neighborhood's rhythms. People normalized the noise, the parties, the fights, so when something as extreme as the murders happened, it took longer for anyone to grasp the gravity. That normalization is a theme in urban crime. You stop perceiving violence as urgency.
Neatly put. And the house itself, 8763, was fortified in ways that read like an attempt to keep the outside world out, but also to signal control. A metal cage around the stairway, pit bulls, an intercom and buzzer. It was, according to neighbors and officers who knew it, a well-known drug den. Inside, it was sleep all day, party all night, heavy cocaine and heroin use, a revolving door of buyers and sex workers, chaos as routine.
Yeah, in those environments, loyalty and menace are braided. You have leaders like Launius, sharpened by prior violence, and others who lean on them. That house was basically a command post for a crew that mixed distribution with burglary and armed robbery. Poverty, debt, addiction, those are accelerants. When money dries up, people take dangerous steps.
Let's meet the principal players, because the center of this story, strangely, is both a porn star and a nightclub mogul. First, the Wonderland Gang. Ron Launius, reputed leader. Billy Deverell, second in command. Joy Miller, who held the lease. David Lind and Tracy McCourt, associates. Barbara Richardson was a young woman sleeping on the couch that night. And Susan Launius, Ron's wife, who survived but with catastrophic brain trauma.
Don't forget the dynamic. Launius was described as cold and dangerous, rumors of violent crimes in his past. Deverell was organized, a career criminal. Joy Miller played that den mother role. They weren't a street gang in the high school sense. They were professional drug addicts turned thieves. And the way they lived created targets. They accumulated enemies, debts, and slights. That's important for motive.
Then, across the street, figuratively speaking, is Eddie Nash. Adel Nasrallah, but everybody called him Eddie Nash. A nightclub owner, Kit Kat, the Starwood, suspected of trafficking cocaine and PCP on a large scale. He cultivated a public persona of affluence and influence. He also had physical muscle around him, guards like Gregory Diles, men who could do violence on command.
Nash is a classic example of a mid-level organized crime figure. Enough cachet to host Hollywood types, enough networks to traffic large quantities of drugs, and enough cold resources, money, enforcers, to retaliate when you cross him. If someone forces him to kneel at gunpoint in his own home, you're not dealing with a garden variety grievance. This is an affront to power.
And then there's John Holmes, one of the most recognizable faces of adult film in the 70s. By the early 80s, his career had cratered. Drugs took over. He was in debt to both Nash and Wonderland. But he was also the connective tissue. He hung out at Nash's and sold drugs for Wonderland. He knew the layout of both worlds. Marcus, this is where the moral ambiguity starts.
Absolutely. Holmes is both a tragic figure and a possible agent of violence. On the one hand, he's an addict, desperate, compromised. On the other, he stands to gain, both financially and in protection, if he helps Nash. The question becomes, under what conditions did he act? Voluntary betrayal? Coerced cooperation? That's the cross the criminal justice system wrestled with for years.
Right. Let's rewind to the pivotal turning point, the Nash robbery on June 29, 1981. According to the reconstruction, Holmes made multiple visits to Nash's home that morning, left a door unlocked, maybe the sliding glass door, and the Wonderland crew, Launius, Deverell, Lind, and McCourt, entered, posing as police, marched Nash and his enforcer Greg Diles into the bedroom, forced open the safe, and left with what's been variously estimated as $1 million in cash and a huge stash of drugs and jewelry. There was also a gun that went off, grazing Diles.
Lots to unpack there. First, the audacity. To enter the house of someone like Nash, assault him, and take his property is a capital error in that world. Nash was wealthy, well-connected, and not the sort of person who would let that slide. Second, the method. Holmes, as an insider giving access, suggests premeditation and betrayal. But third, the immediate outcome. The gang uses or squanders much of the take on drugs and wears Nash's jewelry in public. That's sloppy, which invites retaliation. The robbery doesn't just take property, it humbles Nash publicly.
Holmes wearing Nash's ring in Hollywood, he literally walked around with it. That's when Diles sees him and fury rises. Sources say Diles dragged Holmes back to Nash's house, beat him severely, tying him to a chair, threatening him and his family, and demanded answers. Holmes, according to several witnesses, including Scott Thorson, confesses or breaks under the beating and gives names and addresses. The line between forced cooperation and active complicity begins to blur right there.
And the psychological story is brutal. Imagine being beaten, told your family will be harmed, and presented with a binary choice: cooperate and live, or refuse and die. People under that kind of duress will say things. They'll point, they'll indicate. But coercion muddies mens rea, criminal intent. So even if he pointed the finger, proving that he did so voluntarily is a massive legal hurdle.
Which leads to July 1st, the Wonderland murders. 2 days after the Nash robbery, the Wonderland house is invaded. Neighbors heard screaming around 3 a.m., but the violence was normalized, and nobody called. By the afternoon, movers hear moaning and find a scene of carnage. 4 dead: Ron Launius, Billy Deverell, Joy Miller, Barbara Richardson, and Susan Launius alive but with severe brain injury and amnesia. The weapons were blunt objects, hammers and metal pipes, and the rooms were ransacked.
Cold, efficient, and ferocious. The method, bludgeoning, sends a message. Close range, personal violence meant to terrorize rather than just eliminate. It's the kind of brutality that's meant to punish and humiliate. It's different from, say, a quick gunshot in the street. This was intimate savagery.
Investigators linked Holmes to the scene because his palm print was found on the headboard in Ron Launius's bedroom above Launius's head. That, for many, is the most damning physical evidence. But the picture remains incomplete. Holmes was later arrested in Florida in December 1981 and returned to Los Angeles to stand trial on 4 counts of murder in 1982.
And at that trial, you see the legal tensions. The prosecution, Deputy DA Ronald Cohn, argued Holmes led Nash's men into Wonderland and actively participated. The defense said Holmes was a beaten man, forced at gunpoint to accompany them and perhaps remain helpless. There was no direct testimony placing him swinging a hammer. His palm print is suggestive. Suggestive means not dispositive. Jurors in that case found reasonable doubt and acquitted him on all counts. He was, however, jailed for contempt for refusing to testify about the case.
He served 110 days for contempt, but the story doesn't stop there. By the 1990s, Eddie Nash and his enforcer Gregory Dials stood trial in California for conspiracy to commit the Wonderland murders. Their first trial in 1990 ended in a hung jury. The second, in 1991, produced acquittals. Later, in 2001, a federal RICO indictment culminated in a plea bargain. Nash admitted to ordering his people to retrieve stolen property, and he admitted the bribery, paying $50,000 to an alleged holdout juror. He denied ordering murders, but he accepted responsibility for actions that could have led to violence. He served roughly 3 years and paid fines.
That plea is crucial. Under RICO, prosecutors don't have to prove a murder beyond a reasonable doubt to obtain leverage. They can show patterns of racketeering, bribery, money laundering. Nash's admission that he ordered his men to recover property provides a morally dark plausibility. He created conditions where violence could and did occur. But legally, again, you need a connection between his order and the actual homicides to convict for murder. The evidence didn't sustain that beyond reasonable doubt.
By the end of all trials, nobody was ever convicted for the actual killings at Wonderland. The murders remain officially unsolved. Marcus, you study criminal networks and the limits of legal proof. Why does a case like this evade closure? What are the structural reasons?
Many. First, the quality of witnesses. Your core witnesses are addicts, criminals, or people terrified of retribution. Their credibility is easy to attack. Second, physical evidence is limited. Holmes's palm print exists, but no DNA or blood spatter definitively tying Nash's men to the blows. Third, key actors die or become incapacitated. Holmes died in 1988, Digels later died, Nash died in 2014. Fourth, in complex conspiracies, proving that an order equaled an intent to kill is hard. What did Nash actually say? Were the assailants instructed to kill or to intimidate and retrieve? Finally, there's the juror bribery angle. When a wealthy defendant can manipulate the trial process, prosecution faces an uphill legal climb.
That juror bribery detail is almost surreal. Nash allegedly paid a lone juror $50,000 to hang the jury in the first trial. It reads like a line out of a noir novel, but it matters because it undermined a conviction that may have been close. The federal case later extracted a plea about that bribery, which is textbook corruption of the justice process.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that leaves this case feeling rotten at the core. Even where we have a probable chain robbery, humiliation, retaliation, the system's vulnerabilities prevented a clean legal reckoning. The plea bargain is a form of accountability, but it's partial and unsatisfying to victims' families.
Speaking of victims and families, Susan Launius survived, but with massive brain injury and amnesia. Barbara Richardson was a young woman, 22, dead on a couch. I think it's important for listeners to hear that this story isn't just Hollywood scandal, it's human ruin. Marcus, can we talk about John Holmes's final years? He was acquitted in '82, but his life spiraled, and he died in 1988 from AIDS complications. His wife Sharon later told the Los Angeles Times that he came by their house covered in blood, and that he gave her what's now called the bathtub confession, saying he let men into Wonderland and stood by while they were bludgeoned.
Sharon's account is significant precisely because it's intimate and personal. She remembers him coming in spattered with blood, behavior altered, and she recalls a version in which he admits to enabling the killings but not necessarily delivering the fatal strikes himself. It's a confession that fits the circumstantial case, but it's also after the fact and not under oath. From a historian's perspective, it's essential testimony, colorful and plausible, but from a legal perspective, it's limited. It also raises ethical questions about how to treat posthumous claims.
He apparently told different people different stories. Some say he was forced at gunpoint. Some say he claimed to have hit Ron Launius himself at Nash's behest. The film Wonderland dramatizes one version where Holmes is forced to take the pipe and hit Launius. But we should be clear, those dramatizations are interpretation, not proven fact.
Yes. When we rely on cinematic or memoiristic accounts, we have to remember their narrative choices. They can illuminate emotional truth, but not necessarily factual specificity. Investigators had to live with contradictory accounts. Holmes's variable stories mirror the instability of someone in withdrawal, guilt, or fear states that do not produce reliable narratives.
Let's pause and name the core unanswered questions. There are a handful we keep coming back to. 1. Did Nash order explicit murders, or did he intend only to retrieve his property? 2. Was Holmes a coerced victim or a willing collaborator? 3. Who swung the hammers and pipes? 4. Could Susan Launius have remembered more had she not been so badly injured? 5. Why didn't anyone call for help earlier? Marcus, which of those questions do you find most compelling from a criminological standpoint?
They're all compelling, but the Holmes question matters most. His presence is the clearest link between Nash and Wonderland. If you can establish voluntariness, if Holmes led the killers in with eyes open and intent, then you can make a stronger case that this was ordered retaliation. If, instead, he was terrorized and forced to show the way, then the culpability shifts to Nash's immediate enforcers. The difference changes how we morally and legally assign blame. It's the hinge on which everything else swings.
And we, frankly, will probably never have an airtight answer. Holmes is dead, Giles is dead, memories fade and are contaminated. The only courtroom confessions we have are partial. But we can look at the evidence. Holmes's palm print above Ron's head is a physical fact. He was seen wearing Nash's ring. He was beaten at Nash's house. He reportedly told his wife he led men in. Those pieces add up, for many, to a narrative of complicity. But courts require proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and the defense produced plausible coercion narratives.
That tension between plausibility and legal proof is what makes this case so unsatisfying. In half the population of listeners, those facts add up to conviction in the court of public opinion. In the other half, the standards of law hold. For criminologists, unsolved cases like this are laboratories for understanding how social context, trauma, and legal standards intersect.
I want to go deeper into the Nash robbery for a minute because it's the catalytic event. The robbers reportedly posed as police officers when they entered Nash's home. Dills was grazed by a bullet. He was wounded but not incapacitated. The gang carted back cash, jewelry, and drugs to Wonderland and immediately began ingesting or hiding what they'd taken. That kind of reckless squandering, wearing the jewelry in public, was a provocation. Marcus, why would a group so dangerous act so stupidly?
Addiction does odd things to risk calculation. When someone's high on cocaine and heroin, immediate reward overshadows long-term consequence. There's also the social dynamic of proving manhood. Parading the loot was, in their circle, a display. Plus, some of these guys were not strategic masterminds. They were habitual criminals used to quick scores and quick expenditures. And when you combine euphoria with power symbols, like Nash's ring, you get reckless behavior that invites retaliation. It's an almost textbook example of how substance abuse degrades strategic thinking.
Which, of course, only escalated. The retaliation, however ordered, was brutal in execution. The weapons, hammers and pipes, suggest an intention to brutalize. The rooms were ransacked. It's possible Nash's people wanted to send a message: this is retribution, and we will humiliate and destroy you. Marcus, one of the enduring images in reportage is of Nash being made to kneel at gunpoint during the robbery. That humiliation, how does that factor into interpreting his later behavior?
Humiliation is a powerful motivator in criminal subcultures. It can demand restoration of honor through violence. When a man who styles himself as untouchable is forced to kneel, the wound is not just financial, it's existential. For someone like Nash, retaliation is about restoring a reputation within his network and to anyone who might contemplate crossing him. That context helps explain why the response would be so over the top. He had to demonstrate control.
Let's talk about the initial investigation, because some of the early choices by law enforcement have been criticized. The crime scene, depicted by many as one of the bloodiest in LA history, was discovered by movers around 4 p.m., hours after the murders. Neighbors said they heard screaming earlier, but assumed it was another party. The discovery led to a messy scene: autopsies, blood spatter analysis, limited by the standards of the time, and a community that was reluctant to speak up. Marcus, were there forensic gaps that hampered the investigation?
There were. For one, the state of forensic science in 1981 was primitive compared to today. DNA analysis wasn't available in the way we now rely on it. Blood pattern analysis was more subjective. Fingerprinting existed, but the chaotic scene, dragging of bodies, drug use, and multiple people moving through the house complicated evidence collection. Also, investigators had to deal with a community of witnesses who may have been high, uncooperative, or too terrified to testify. All of that limited the pool of usable evidence.
And there's the political environment. Nash was well-connected, and the defense later argued that he could manipulate juries and the system. The alleged juror bribery in the first trial is an example, paying $50,000 to a holdout jury member to scuttle a conviction. That eventually came out in the RICO plea. To many, the wheels turned, but justice never fully closed.
Which is why many observers call this a case study in the limits of prosecutorial reach. You can assemble credible narratives, rack up suspicious details, and still lose in court if the defense creates reasonable doubt. And in investigations that touch organized crime, you face intimidation, perjury, jury tampering, structural corruption that erodes the possibility of a clean conviction.
Let's step back and look at the cultural resonance. The Wonderland murders sit at the crossroads of Hollywood's sleazy margins, the porn industry's marginalization, and the cocaine boom. Films like Boogie Nights and Wonderland itself mine this material. But as we said earlier, dramatic portrayals can conflate fact and fiction. Marcus, why do you think this story keeps drawing filmmakers and writers?
Because it has all the elements of myth. A fallen celebrity, an overreaching crime boss, a violent underworld meeting celebrity culture. It's cinematically rich, characters, shocking turns, moral rot. For artists, it's fertile ground to explore how fame and addiction coalesce into ruin. But creators compress complexity for narrative coherence. That's why dramatizations ought to be consumed critically. Artistic truth is not the same as historical truth.
I agree, and yet, for listeners, those dramatizations often become the dominant version of events. They shape public memory. I want to give listeners a sense of some concrete vignettes, images that recur in reporting and testimony. The caged stairway and pit bulls, Nash on his knees, Holmes walking around with that ring, the movers opening the door to a room soaked in blood, Sharon Holmes reporting a bathtub confession. These are the images that stick.
Add to that the juror bribery. It's a small, almost mundane image of a man handing an envelope that has outsized consequences. It's one of those details that, when we put them together, creates a mosaic of criminal worlds leaking into civic processes.
We've covered the what and the who. Now, the how and the why are the philosophical parts. Why did these people make the choices they did? Was any of this inevitable? From a criminological lens, Marcus, what explains the cascade from robbery to massacre?
It's a combination of structural and situational factors. Structurally, poverty, addiction, and marginalization push people into high-risk criminal behavior. Situationally, the robbery humiliated a powerful man who had resources for retaliatory violence. Add in the personal psychologies, Launius's potential sadism, Holmes's desperation, Nash's need to reassert dominance, and you have factors that escalate conflict quickly. Think of it as escalation dynamics. A spark in a tinderbox will ignite a conflagration if conditions are met.
Hard to listen to. Harder for the people involved. Before we go to the questions we can never fully answer, I want to ask you about the families. Victims like Barbara Richardson have stories that were cut short. Susan survived, but lost memory. How do we keep the human toll in focus in a case that invites so much sensationalism?
We can start by insisting on victims' names, not reducing them to plot devices. We can examine their lives and the ways addiction exploited them. We can critique narratives that fetishize violence while ignoring the social contexts that produce it. And we can hold the dialogue to facts where possible, and label the rest clearly as speculation. That way, memory respects the victim's dignity while still confronting the grotesque.
Beautifully said. Okay, let's be direct. Where does the weight of the evidence lie? If you had to summarize, without courtroom language, what is the most plausible account?
The most plausible account is this. Holmes arranged access to Nash's home. Launius and associates robbed Nash, humiliating him. Nash, enraged, had Holmes beaten and coerced him to reveal names and locations. Either Nash's enforcers or men acting on his behalf, possibly including Dials, attacked 8763 Wonderland to retrieve property and retaliate. The assault escalated into murder. Holmes was present. His palm print places him in the Launius bedroom, and he likely facilitated access. Whether he delivered blows is unclear. Whether Nash explicitly ordered murder is unclear. But, causally, Nash's robbery created the conditions that led to the massacre.
So theft led to humiliation, led to retaliation. Holmes is the bridge between worlds. The exact identities of the hitters remain unknown and legally unproven. That's the skeleton. Now, let's do the thing we always do on this show. We'll go through the big unanswered questions and be explicit about what we will probably never know.
Go.
Question 1. Did Nash order the killings? We can say plausible, yes. He admitted to ordering a retrieval of property in his RICO plea, and he had motive and means. But he denied ordering murder, and the courts never proved the linkage beyond a reasonable doubt. Question 2. Was Holmes a coerced victim or an active participant? Sharon Holmes' bathtub confession suggests complicity. He led men into Wonderland and stood by. But many contemporaneous witnesses, and Holmes's own fluctuating accounts, muddy whether he struck blows. Question 3. Who swung the hammers? Possible candidates include Dials and other Nash enforcers, but no one was identified and convicted. Question 4. Could Susan Launius have remembered more? She suffered severe brain injury and claims amnesia. Unless she regained memories privately, we may never know. Question 5. Why no earlier call for help? Normalization of violence, fear of the gang, and the culture of the neighborhood likely combined to silence immediate responses.
Addendum. Even if new evidence surfaced today, the passage of time complicates prosecutions. Witnesses die, memories degrade, forensic opportunities vanish. So the legal closure seems improbable. That doesn't mean moral clarity is impossible. Historians and journalists can still produce coherent narratives.
Our duty as storytellers is to present those coherent narratives honestly, distinguishing evidence from inference. Before we close, Marcus, I want your sense. What does the Wonderland case teach us about crime in late 20th century Los Angeles?
It teaches that the city's glitz coexisted with vicious subterranean economies, that entertainment and vice networks created porous boundaries where celebrity, addiction, and organized crime intersected. It shows how the justice system is vulnerable to procedural compromise and how addiction can destroy agency while producing culpability. And it reminds us that violence often follows a logic, retaliation, honor, and market correction that is chillingly orderly in its brutality.
Jonestown, Manson, Wonderland. Different in scale, same in human wreckage. Okay, we'll end with an image. Imagine walking up that caged stairwell today. The paint flakes, the dogs are gone, the intercom is silent. But the echo of banging hammers, of someone pleading, of a young woman's breath stopping, those echoes remain. The case sits in archives, in trial transcripts, in confessions told in bathtubs, and in jail cells where men remember and forget.
It sits in a city that stitched together fame and ruin. And in the silence, the unanswered questions continue to insist on being heard.
Thank you for walking through it with me, Marcus. For listeners who want to dig deeper, we'll include a reading list in the episode notes. LA Times reporting, the Crime Library narrative, the Salon piece, and the film Wonderland. Watch it critically. This case resists tidy endings, but it deserves persistent attention.
Thanks, Alex. And to listeners, hold fast to the victims' names. Remember that sensationalism should never eclipse the human cost.
We'll be back next week with another still unanswered case. If you have tips or documents related to Wonderland, we're open to receiving materials, but please respect the families. This is Alexandra Monroe. Marcus Ellery, thank you. Good night.